So what I'll do, I will create a Redshift cluster from AWS console. So I'll have to create a VPC first, then I'll create subnets, and then security groups, then I'll create subnet group, and then I'll create the Redshift cluster. Let us go ahead and do that. The cluster that I'm going to create would incur some charges. I'll talk about the free tier after the demo is over. So this is my AWS console. I have rearranged the favorites, Redshift first and then Athena and so on and so forth. So I have put VPC and EC2 here also. The first thing that I'm going to do is to create a VPC. So let me open this a new tab. This is my VPC console. Click on your VPC. Right now I do not have any VPC created. So let me go ahead and create a VPC. I'll mention on VPC only, not VPC and more, because I feel this is a little bit easier. Let me go ahead and give a name tag. So I'll name it as Data Engineering on AWS VPC is the name of the VPC, then its corresponding CIDR block. Let's say 10.0.0.0/16. The tenancy would be default, and I'll add one more tag. I'll mention owner as www.3iam.n. So let me go ahead and create this particular VPC. Alright, the VPC has been created. I can go ahead and create subnets now, but before that, let me go ahead and create internet gateway and route tables. Click on create internet gateway and I'll name it as data engineering on AWS VPC internet gateway. That's all. Click on create, and once it gets created, the state is detached. So I'll be attaching this to a VPC, which will be of course our VPC, which is data engineering on AWS VPC. So I have created the VPC and I have created internet gateway and I have attached the internet gateway to the VPC. So the next step is to create route tables. We'll follow the same process that we had done earlier. Click on route tables and I have a default route table, but I'll be creating two route tables. One would be public route table, which will be of course for our VPC. I will click on edit routes because as it is a public route table, I'll have to add one more route, which would be to internet via the internet gateway, which is data engineering on AWS VPC IGW. So this route table has been created. Let me go ahead and create the private route table also. And here I do not have to mention any additional route. Now let me go ahead and create subnets. I'll create 6 subnets, 3 public and 3 private. So the first one would be public subnet 1A because I want to create this in US East 1A region. This is my VPC CIDR block and my subnet CIDR block would be 1.0/24. The public subnets would have 1, 2, 3 and the private subnets would have 100, 200 and 300 CIDR blocks. So let me go ahead and create one more public subnet. So I want to create 3. So this would be in public in the AZ1B and the CIDR block would be 10.0.20.24 and I want to create one more subnet which will be in AZ1C and the CIDR block would be 10.0.3.0/24. So these are the 3 subnets that I'm creating. These are all public subnets. Of course, I mean, they are not public yet. So what I'll do is that I will attach the public route table and I'll do the same for the other 2 subnets also. Let me go ahead and create 3 more subnets which will be private subnets and they'll be in the same AZ1A, 1B and 1C. So I'm creating 3 private subnets in AZ1A, 1B and 1C. The CIDR block is 10.0.10.0.24, 10.0.20.0.24 and 10.0.30.0.24. I'm creating these three subnets, and these will be private subnets. So let me go ahead and associate route tables to these subnets. I'll be attaching the private route table. So I have 6 subnets, 3 public and 3 private. I have 2 route table, one public route table and one private and one default. So I do not have any subnet associated with the default route table. And of course I have one internet gateway. And now the next thing that I want to do is I want to create security groups. I'll not touch the network ACLs. So let me create 2 security groups. One is public security group and the other one would be private security group. So in this security group, I'm allowing all traffic from all the location. The security group has been created, and the inbound rule, I'll be adding a rule wherein I will allow all traffic from internet. So this is the public security group. So let me go ahead and create a private security group also. And I'm adding an inbound rule. Here I'm mentioning that I want to allow all traffic from VPC, which is 10.0.0.0/16, and outbound is all allowed, of course. So I have created 2 security groups. One is a public security group and the other one is private security group. So for now, in the public security group, I have allowed all traffic in the inbound rule. Of course, I'll change it later on. So as of now, you can see that all traffic is allowed. I'll go ahead and change it in future. And in the private security group, I have allowed only traffic from my VPC, which is 10.0.0/16. All right, so this is done. Let us go ahead and create the Redshift cluster. So I had shown you this console earlier also. So this is the Redshift landing page, and the first thing that it asks you or tells you is to try Redshift serverless for free. So we'll not create serverless as of now. I have not told you what serverless is and how do you use serverless. So first we'll go ahead and create Redshift provision clusters. So I had already told you about these options. What are these? So to create a cluster, of course, we'll have to either you can create provision cluster dashboard, and from here you have this option of create cluster, or you can click on clusters, and here also you have an option of create cluster. You can use any one. So I'm using this create cluster option, and I'll be creating a cluster now. So let's name the cluster as data engineering on Redshift, data engineering on AWS, Redshift cluster 1. After I complete this demo, I'll be deleting this cluster. Make sure to delete the cluster whenever you are done with HandsOn so that your charges are not high. So this is the name of the cluster, data engineering on AWS Redshift cluster 1. The next thing is, it is telling you to choose the size of the cluster. So there are two options. One is I'll choose and the other one is help me choose. Of course, I'll select I'll choose because I'll mention what options we have. So the next option, in fact, the very first option in the configuration is node type. So we have already talked about node types. These are nothing but EC2 instances. So I have told you about RA3 node types and DC2 node types. So in RA3 node type, you get a separation of compute and storage, which is an architectural implementation that is different from DC2 node types. So in DC2 node types, you get the storage associated with the compute itself. So if you have to increase the compute, you have to increase the storage also unnecessarily. Or if you have to increase the storage, you'll have to add compute also unnecessarily. So if your storage size is 1 terabyte and less and it is not going to grow as much, then you can go ahead and use DC2 node types. But in all the other cases, you should be using RA3 node types only. Now in this case, there are multiple options. We have RA3 XL plus, 4x large and 16x large. So it tells you that what is the price and what is the capacity that you get. So if you see here, it is telling you that RA3 XL Plus gives you a managed storage of up to 4 terabyte for single node clusters, and for clusters with 2 or more nodes, each node has up to 32 terabytes. So this is the managed storage, which is Redshift managed storage. The price is $1.086 per node per hour. The storage is 0.024 GB per month, and it gives you 4 vCPUs. 4x large, again, same things. You get managed storage of up to 128 terabytes per node, which includes the local storage plus S3. This is the price per hour, and you get 12 vCPUs. You can use RA3 16x large also, which gives you 128 terabytes per node of Redshift managed storage, and you get 48 vCPU per node. Now in DC2.large, you get attached storage of 160 GB per node, and you get 2 vCPUs. And you have one more DC2, which is DC2 8x large, wherein you get 2.6 terabytes per node of storage and 32 vCPUs. Now if you select, let's say, RA3 4x large, and I mention that I want to create 4 nodes, it tells you the cost per month. So I'll be incurring approximately $9,520 per month if I keep this node running all the time, and I'll get a storage of 512 terabytes. The storage price would be 0.024 per GB per month. Of course, this is a pretty huge price. I'll not need 4 nodes for my training purpose. If I select, let's say, XL Plus, either single AZ or multi AZ, and if I select 4 nodes, I'll get $3,171 per month of bill for compute, and I'll get 128 terabytes of storage with 0.024 GB per month storage. Now this is the maximum storage that I can get. If I, let's say, upload only 500 GB of data, then I'll be charged for 500 GB of storage, not 128 terabytes. And if I reduce it to, let's say, one node, RA3 XL Plus, then it will be approximately $800 per month of compute storage. All right, so this is the compute part. Then the next option is AZ. So whether you want to have single AZ configuration or multi AZ configuration. So if you remember the cluster topology diagram, I had shown you 2 AZs. Let me bring up the diagram again. So this is the diagram. So if you see, I have AZ1 and AZ2. So if I create compute nodes only in AZ1, so it will be a single AZ cluster. But if I create compute nodes in 2 AZs inside of subnets, of course, then it will be a multi-AZ cluster. I have option of creating single AZ or multi-AZ. Now I'm selecting single AZ and RA3 XL Plus. Then I have sample data, database configurations, wherein I'll have to provide the admin username. So in this case, the default admin user is AWS user, and you can mention password to be managed by AWS Secrets Manager. You can generate a password. You can ask Redshift to generate a password for admin, or you can manually add the admin password. So I'll be adding an admin password. You can do the same for yourself. Then I have cluster permissions, so I'll have to mention the IAM roles. Again, why do we need cluster permissions? Because it'll be loading data from S3, it'll be unloading data to S3, we'll be having integration with other services. So for all those, I'll have to associate a cluster permission. I'll not be doing it right now. I'll be creating an IAM role, and then I'll be creating the cluster. This is just an overview that I'm showing. Then I have additional configurations wherein I can mention network and security, or rather I'll have to mention network and security, database configurations, maintenance, monitoring, and backup. Let's take a look at network and security. So in network and security, of course, I'll have to mention the VPC. I can mention a VPC security group. So I'll mention the private security group. Then I'll have to create something called a subnet group. I do not have any subnet group yet. So what is this subnet group? Again, if I go back to the diagram, I need to have subnets from 2 different AZs. So I have created my VPC in 3 AZs. I have to create a subnet group wherein I'll add subnets from at least 2 different AZs, and then I'll be launching the nodes, either 1, 2 or more, in that subnet group, and that will create the Redshift cluster. So here I have not created any subnet group as of yet, so I'll have to do that, and then I can mention the availability zone. So I'll do that after the walkthrough is done. So this is the networking portion. Then I have database configurations, wherein I can mention the database name, the first database that you want to create. So let's say this database will be created when the Redshift cluster is created. Of course, you can add more databases later on, and you can keep this as is. The database port by default is 5439. You can change it also, but you can keep it as is. And then we have parameter groups, wherein we mention the database configurations. We'll talk about parameter groups later on when we discuss workload management. Then we have maintenance window. So I can select a maintenance window. There's a default maintenance window. If I unselect this, I'll have to mention maintenance window for cluster updates. What happens is that Redshift releases newer versions of the databases or the cluster. So those newer versions have to be upgraded in our cluster also. So in the maintenance window, I mentioned that at what time the clusters can be upgraded. And then I have maintenance track. It tells you there are two types of tracks, current and trailing. Current is essentially the latest version, so use the most current approved cluster version, and trailing is n-1, so which is current version -1. In most of the cases you'll be using trailing because current version is new. You do not want to experiment in your production environment, so you can use trailing. Then you have monitoring. So monitoring is done by CloudWatch. I do not have any alarms as of now, so you can go ahead and create alarms. Then backup. Redshift allows you automated snapshots, which are basically periodic backups of your cluster, of your entire cluster. What happens is that you can mention how long the backup would be retained. So it can be anywhere from 1 day to 35 days, meaning that the automatic, if I take an automatic backup today and I mention the retention period to be 35, after 35 days, today's backup would be deleted. I can take a manual snapshot also, and it says how long do you want to retain your manual snapshot. It can be 1 day, 7 days, or a custom value. So by default it is indefinitely. You can mention 1 day, 7 day, or whatever. We have a feature called cross region snapshot. We'll talk about backup and snapshot later on. And then we have something called cluster relocation, which we'll discuss later on. Then you can click on create cluster and the cluster would be created. But before that, of course, I have to do something. I'll have to create the subnet group. So once the subnet group is created, I'll be launching the cluster in that particular subnet group. Now, one more thing I want to tell you, after creating the subnet group, I'll have to create an IAM role also for this Redshift cluster. So let us go ahead and create the IAM roles and the subnet group and then come back to the screen. So first I'll be creating the subnet group. So scroll down and you have configurations here. Click on configurations and click on subnet groups. I do not have any subnet group as of now. Click on create cluster subnet group. I'll name it as Redshift subnet group, and it will be in the VPC that I have just created, and then I'll be adding AZ. So let me select US to 1A and select the public subnet. Click on add subnet, it will be added. I can create a subnet group with one subnet also, by the way. It does not have to be minimum 2 subnets. It can be with one subnet also. But anyway, I'll go ahead and create the subnet group with all the private subnets that I have so that I can create a multi-AZ cluster later on if needed. And as a best practice, this is what you should do. You should create a subnet group with multiple subnets across AZs so that you can create a multi-AZ Redshift cluster for your development, QA, or production environment. Click on create subnet group and it has been created. So if I click here, So this subnet group has been created in this VPC, and this is the name, and it has 3 subnets. Now before creating the cluster, I'll have to add the IAM role. Let me do that. Click on IAM, and you already know how to create roles. Click on roles. If you do not know how to do that, it's better that you go through the optional videos where I have uploaded videos for IAM. Click on create role, and it has to be an AWS service because I need my Redshift cluster to have access to S3. So Redshift cluster is created by Redshift, which is an AWS service. So I'll have to create my role for an AWS service. So that will be the trusted entity. So if I'll have to select a service here, type Redshift, and there you go. We have Redshift. So there are 3 options: Redshift customizable, Redshift, and Redshift scheduler. So I'll have to use Redshift customizable because I want to give custom role. If you select Redshift and click on next, it will add this Redshift service linked role policy. This is not needed. So what I'll do is that I will select this Redshift customizable, click on next, and add the permission. So right now I want to give S3 permission. Of course, I'll be adding more permissions later on, but as of now, Amazon S3 full access should do. Click on next, and the role would be AWS Redshift S3 full access role, and I have put the name in the description also. Now here I have this permission AWS S3 full access. I can add a tag here and then click on create role. So I have this role, data engineering on AWS S3 full access role. It has been created. So now I am ready to create my cluster. Let me go ahead and create the cluster. So I'll tell you how to create a cluster in free tier. So the cluster that I'm going to create would be under free tier, but in free tier, of course, all the features are not supported. So when you do hands-on for whatever feature, then we'll go ahead and create a cluster with RA3 node where all the features are supported. As we have all the components ready, let us go ahead and create the cluster. As mentioned earlier, you can create the cluster from the clusters dashboard or from the provisioned clusters dashboard. So let us go ahead and create it. Click on create cluster. I had already walked you through this particular screen. Let me do that again. So first thing is the name of the cluster. So I'll name it as AWS Redshift cluster, and then I will choose the size of the cluster. So I'll have to select the node types. Notice that we do not have any option to create leader node because leader nodes are provided to us by default and for free. So we do not have to create leader nodes, and leader nodes are always highly available. Now in this case, whenever I select the node type, I'm selecting node type for compute nodes, not for leader node. So if I click here, of course, I have the RA3 and the DC2 nodes. So in RA3, I have RA3 XL plus, RA3 4x large, RA3 16x large. And in DC2, we have DC2 large and DC2 8x large. Now, as per free tier, you can create only DC2.large node types. If your AWS account is new and you have not used Redshift earlier, you can create DC2 large instance and it will be free for 2 months. But there's a caveat. You cannot run DC2.large instance for more than 750 hours. A single DC2.large instance. Which means if you are running 2 DC2.large instance or 2 DC2.large node types, then you cannot run it for more than 375 hours a month. If it is 3 DC2.large instance, you'll get 250 hours. I hope you get the drift. So what I'll do for this particular exercise, I'll not use RA3, I'll use DC2.large instance type. And the number of nodes would be 2. It also tells me the cost per month that I'll incur beyond free tier. Had my account not been free tier, and if I provision 2 DC2.large compute nodes, then I'll be charged at $365 per month, and I'll get a compressed storage of 320 GB. The reason we have 320 GB, but because a single node of DC2.large type will give us 160 GB. Now, if you select, let's say, RA3 4x large, it will also show you the cost, which is approximately $4,760 per month, and you'll get a compressed storage of 256 terabytes, and you can create anywhere from 2 to 32 nodes. And if I select, let's say, 32, then if you see, my total storage becomes 4.1 petabytes, and my cost would be approximately $76,150 per month. Similarly, if I select RA3.16x large, I can have 2 to 128 nodes in total. So if I select, let's say, 2, I'll get 256 terabytes, because a single RA3.16x large will give us 128 terabytes of Redshift managed storage, or RMS. If I select 128 nodes, it will give me 16.4 petabytes with a cost of $1.22 million per month. Of course, we do not have so much of money, so let us use the free tier, which is DC2.large and only 2 compute nodes. If I want, I can load sample data, but I'll load sample data later on. And this is the admin user. I'll not change it, I'll keep it as AWS user. If you want, you can mention it as admin also, or any other name that you want. So there are 3 options. We can manage the admin credentials in AWS Secret Manager. Using Secret Manager, we can store the password secretly. We can ask AWS Redshift to generate a password for admin and give it to us, or we can manually add the admin password. So I'll manually add the admin password, but in production you should use AWS Secret Manager only. So this is the password that I have provided, and then cluster permission. We have already created an IAM role. So let me go ahead and associate the IAM role. So this is the role, data engineering on AWS Redshift S3 full access role. Now this IAM role has full access to S3. So I'll associate this. Now the next thing would be network and security. We have only one VPC, which is data engineering on AWS VPC, and the security group would be data engineering on AWS private security group. I'll remove the default one. Why private? Because I want to create the cluster in a private subnet. I would not create this cluster in public subnet. So if you are practicing, you do the same also. Do not create the cluster in public subnet, always create it in a private subnet. And this is the subnet group that we had just created. And if I want, I can select the availability zone, either US East 1A, B or C. I do not have any preference as of now. Definitely, I do not want to make it publicly accessible, so I'll keep it unchecked. Then I have database configurations. So this is the default database that will be created. And I'll talk about parameter groups in WLM, or workload management. Maintenance, I'll keep everything as is right now. And in backup, I'll keep an automatic backup retention period of 0, because I do not want any automated backup or any automated snapshot. That's why it is 0. And if I select manual, I'll make it 1 day. I'm not going to take any manual snapshot as of now. I will not configure cross-region snapshot, because we do not want that. So this is how we'll create a Redshift cluster with 2 DC2.large compute nodes. Let me go ahead and click on create cluster. So the cluster would be created. Now let me show you how the behavior would be different if we use, or if you select RA3 nodes. So let me click on create cluster. There are few differences if I use RA3 nodes. I'll not create this, I'll just show you. So let's say cluster RA3 is the name of the cluster. So let's say RA3.XL plus, I need 2 compute nodes. This is the cost. I do not want to load any sample data. Let me add the admin password manually. Associate the same IAM role that I had created. Network and security configuration would be same. I'll select the private security group and no preference. There's something called enhanced VPC routing. We do not want that. and we'll keep the database configuration as is, similar to DC2. Again, I'll keep the maintenance as is as well. But here we have some changes. Now, so if I use RA3, I cannot have automated snapshot as 0. It has to be 1. It cannot be 0. It has to be always non-zero with minimum of 1. And remaining things are the same. I'll create RA3 instances later on because there are some features which are supported only in RA3 node types, not in DC2 node types. Now if I go to the cluster, so my cluster has been created. So let me click on this. Either you can see the cluster from here, or you can go to this provisioned cluster dashboard. I have 2 nodes, both are on demand. There are no reserve nodes. We'll talk about these pricing options later on. I do not have any automated snapshots or manual snapshots. And this is the cluster DE AWS Redshift cluster. And there's some high level monitoring. Again, I'll not talk about monitoring now. We'll talk about it later on. Click on this cluster and it takes me to this particular page, which has a lot of information. It tells me the cluster identifier, which is DE AWS Redshift cluster. Then we have the cluster namespace ARN. So this is the ARN of the Redshift cluster. Then the cluster configuration is production, status is available. The node type is dc2.large. We have 2 nodes. This is the patch version. It is not multi-AZ. We can create multi-AZ also. This is the endpoint which we'll use to connect to the cluster. If you want to connect using JDBC, this is the JDBC URL. If you want to connect using ODBC, this is the driver. And if you scroll down, there are a lot of monitoring options that you can see here. But as of now, I'll not go through the monitoring options. We'll talk about it later on. So you can see cluster performance here. There are multiple tabs. Query monitoring. We can monitor the queries that you have run in the cluster. Then databases. What databases do you have? There are additional features like data shares, 0 ETLs. We'll talk about it later on. And a few other tabs that we have. If you click on properties, it will tell you the database name, default database name that has been created, whether encryption has been enabled or not, SSH ingestion setting, then the network and security settings. This is the VPC, this is the subnet group, security group, AZ, so on and so forth. And this is the IAM role that has been associated with the cluster. These are the IP addresses of the node. This is the leader node, which we did not mention. Still, we got a leader node by default and for free. This is the public IP address of the leader node, and this is the private IP address. So if you see, private IP address is 10.0.10. something because this is the subnet that we have associated, and these two are the compute nodes, compute 0, compute 1. Even though we have public IP address for all the nodes, we cannot connect to the Redshift cluster from my machine or anywhere else because I have not enabled public access, and moreover these are in private subnets, not in public subnets. So the private IP address would make more sense. All right, and then if you have data in this particular cluster, we can click on this query data and use query editor v2, which we'll talk about in detail later on, to query the records or query the data that you have in this particular cluster. And then you can edit some configuration, clicking on edit, and using app actions you have multiple options, multiple actions to do. Okay, so one more thing that I missed mentioning, if I click on create cluster again, and if I select RA3 node type, I have a configuration of single AZ and multi-AZ. So I have already talked about single AZ and multi-AZ. So if I select multi-AZ, the cluster would be created in different AZs that are mentioned in the subnet group. If I click on single AZ, the cluster would be created only in one AZ and in the subnet which is there in that particular AZ. We have not created RA3, so that's why I cannot mention single AZ and multi-AZ. So if you select DC2, it does not have any option of single AZ or multi-AZ because DC2 node types are always created in one AZ, not in multiple AZs. The option of single AZ and multi-AZ is only there in RA3 nodes. Any RA3 node types will give you the option to create your Redshift cluster either in one AZ or in multiple AZs as per the subnet group that you have created. So I have my cluster up and running. So this is the first hands-on that we have done. Let's go ahead and continue the discussion.